I'll have people like approach me and say, what's the cheapest way I can get this done? The cheapest way is filling out a questionnaire, having a 5-minute conversation, and then getting a diagnosis. The risk with that, like they know that you meet those criteria, but like when we're looking at ASD, we're looking at ADHD, we're looking at social anxiety, we're looking at OCD, we're looking at trauma-related presentations or other kind of reasons why someone might have certain things that they would check off on a checklist.
Hello and welcome. We're so glad you're tuning into the Taking Good Care show. I'm Dr. Andrew Wong, based in Toronto, Canada.
And I'm Dr. David St. Arnaud, based in Edmonton, Canada. We're two practicing psychologists with over a decade of experience each, working in a variety of settings and supporting diverse populations.
Thanks for joining us. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. While we're both practicing psychologists, our podcast is intended purely for educational and entertainment purposes. It's not a substitute for professional mental health care or treatment. If you're in need of support, we strongly encourage you to reach out to a licensed mental health professional in your area. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. Welcome to the Taking Good Care podcast.
Another episode, another Friday, and excited for my deeper under the weather voice.
Yeah, and this is on the heels of just meeting with our editor and getting some feedback in terms of where we're going with this and areas we can improve on. So definitely have some of that floating around in my head. Definitely just really appreciative for our editor and all the work that he has done behind the scenes for this show and the passion that we see. Yeah, that he believes in the mission that we're doing, and that means a lot. So now some of the feedback I think that we're going to try to do a bit today is have a little more structure, a little more kind of skeleton to what we're talking about, and piggybacking, or maybe even should have did this before the last episode, but here we go, because we're learning as we're doing this thing.
We're learning, and I think we're coming up to a year behind the scenes. Just for listeners to know, our editor, David Matta, he is in one of the episodes. He, myself, Dave, we've been talking about that year mark. What can we do differently? So certainly there's going to be some changes coming up. Not so much the content, but maybe the structure of the podcast itself, hopefully for the better. And probably at that time too, David Matta's title will not just be editor, but probably our producer at that point. So
yeah,
exciting.
So send all your emails to him. Oh no, this is so fun, and I enjoy doing this. This is a highlight of my week sometimes.
Only sometimes.
There's other things in my life that I love, like my kids and wife and my friends. Yeah. But this is up there. This is right up there. And I never really would have anticipated that I would feel this optimistic and that I would get this much joy out of doing something like this, because it really is on the edge of my comfort zone. But I'm loving what we're doing, and I'm loving the feedback, and that it seems to be appreciated, and we'll see where this goes. But getting back to today, what are we going to focus on today?
So it's ASD part 2 today. We were just going through a skeleton, and there can easily be 4 episodes just on neurodiversity, on autism spectrum disorder. And I think Dave mentioned this a few minutes ago. I think for today's episode, it's pulling it back a little bit, because in listening to the previous episode, depending on your background and knowledge in ASD, some of you may have thought that was too basic, or perhaps it was at your level because you've read up on it before. And then maybe you're not so much well-versed in ASD and autism. And maybe some of the language or some of the things that we talked about might have been maybe too far along in terms of maybe a little bit more advanced than what you would have liked. So I think today it's like pulling it back a little bit and talking more about the foundations of ASD.
Yeah, I like that. I think the foundational knowledge that might actually help you make better sense of some of the things we talked about last episode, right? So for those folks, you might want to re-listen or go back, and it might make a little more sense. So we're going to start right off with the definition, but like a more the clinical definition, the characteristics or the criteria that needs to be met to have a formal diagnosis of ASD, autism spectrum disorder. And I know, Andrew, this is your jam. This is your area of expertise. So I'll let you kind of lead, and then I'll be here to support. I'm familiar with the criteria, but this is not a type of assessment that I do in my practice.
And I think to your point about how much we know about ASD, this is where like I can go into an assessment nowadays or do a quick observation, and a lot of the time I can come up with a pretty quick conclusion just right off the hop in terms of my clinical conclusions. So that's why this is really interesting to just go back and slow it all down even in my own brain to look at the diagnostic criteria. So when we talk about diagnostic criteria, psychologists use the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, fifth edition, and there's a revised edition right now too. It's called the TR edition. And psychologists will use this huge manual to go through what is outlined as different clinical disorders. And we really fleshed out the last episode about ASD being a neurodevelopmental disorder, meaning that it's from birth. And when even thinking about that last episode, I don't think we even talked about the one question I get all the time, is it nature or nurture? And it's such a tough question to answer, but we do know that there is certainly a genetic component to it, right? This is why we can say that it is a neurodevelopmental disorder. Do we know exactly and specifically the genes that contribute to it? There are some ideas for it, but again, there's no conclusive evidence yet to say that this is the one gene. If we were at that point, I'm sure there would be tests for it.
Yeah.
And you can probably do some tests in utero to say, okay, will your child have ASD? But we're not there. We're not there.
I don't think we'll ever get there. I think what
Yeah.
will happen is that we're going to get more specific. Like right now, it is a spectrum, right? And so, what brain areas are involved with what kind of symptoms or criteria? I think we're going to keep fine tuning this. And with neuroimaging and other advances in science, we're going to be able to get a better idea of what causes these differences in the brains that we have. So right now, I think a lot of our mental health diagnoses, they change over time, and we know that. So always holding that with a real like respect that we don't know everything. And this is what we know right now. This is the diagnosis right now.
And even when you think about the fetus developing in utero, so many things can happen within that environment, right? So it's almost like those genes being turned on and off within that very rapidly developing environment. Some genes may get damaged along the way. Some genes may be deleted along the way. You know, why that happens, people are still trying to figure that out. So when I get that question of, is it nature or nurture? It can be multiple factors, the genetic piece, but also when we think environment, no, it's not so much did you use Lysol when your child was 6 months old, or did you introduce something? Is it something they ate? It's not that simple, right? It can happen in utero. That in and of itself is an environment,
Yeah.
right? So a lot of time you can't control these things either.
No, and we know from like genetics and epigenetics, like there's different things that turn genes on or off. It is far more complex than just mapping the genome and the expression of our genes. So I always think about height. It's based on your parents' genetics, right? If you have tall parents, you're likely going to be taller. If you have short, right? And you're going to be somewhere close to your parents in terms of your height. But your nutrition, your sleep, those are the kind of things that will affect whether you hit the kind of top end of your genetic expression or the lower end in terms of height, right? So it's both. And all of these diagnoses, and we haven't even talked about this, but like the stress diathesis model, is
Yeah.
that right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Somewhere close to that. Anyways, it's like you might even have genes for a certain condition that don't get expressed until you hit stress, until there's a certain thing that happens in your
Like a
life,
threshold.
a threshold. Yeah.
Yeah.
So without
Yeah.
that stressor, you might never develop a certain condition. So there,
Exactly.
it's very complex, but ASD is not one of those. ASD does not relate to stressors. It is something that you're typically born with. How you express it, to what degree you struggle with some of the challenges, that is going to depend on the environment around you, and it's going to depend on your own coping strategies too, or the coping strategies of the people around you. Yeah.
Yeah. And that gene expression piece too, just to round this all out, it's not just from the biological parents. If you think about, I'll go back to your example of height, Dave. Sometimes I'll get clients because I do work with a lot of kids and teenagers where, let's say, a preteen or a teenager just sprouts like way taller than parents, right? And so the gene's in there somewhere. And then I'll sometimes ask parents, like, where'd you get this? Where do you get this height from? And they'll be like, oh, they have an aunt or an uncle or grandparents who are like super tall. So don't forget too, gene expression is not just from the biological parents. It is from the biological parents, but they may not be expressed in the parents themselves, but then it gets expressed in the child. So when we talk about ASD, is there a genetic component? Yes. Some parents will be like, none of us are really like that. But then I'll get parents who are like, oh, but we do have a relative. And it's like this eureka moment. It's could this run in the family a little bit? Maybe, maybe. But that's the genetic piece around it, is that it's way more complex than it seems. It's not just, oh, does the father have it or does the mother have it? It's not that simple.
Again, as we're talking about this, what are we actually talking about? So let's go back. There's 5 criteria that need to be met, and let's walk listeners through. Not in We don't want you like walking around trying to diagnose everyone, right? A little information sometimes can be dangerous, but I think it's important to understand the core elements that a clinician might be looking for when they're possibly diagnosing someone, or
Yeah.
if you have a relationship and you already know someone on the spectrum, that it might give you a better understanding of some of these areas that might be different than for yourself, and that again, these differences don't need to be good or bad. They're a variation. And
Yeah.
so being able to understand the differences and accommodate for differences, I hope that's the takeaway from a lot of our podcasts.
And like I said last time, this is not a checklist where you just check off boxes, right? It's the quality of these criteria that we're going to go through. The first one is social emotional reciprocity, right? Is the child or the individual able to do well in terms of understanding other people's emotions, understanding other people's intentions, even understanding how to react in a certain situation or a certain reaction to other people. That's that reciprocity piece, right? If somebody, I'll give an example here. Let's say a student's walking down the hall and, you can have a situation where it's a rowdy hallway and someone bumps another child. Is that child who got bumped able to see it as, oh, it was a mistake, it was an error. I understand this whole environment. It's crazy right now. It's chaotic. So I'll just brush it off like nothing else. You might say something like, hey, come on, like be careful. But then on the flip side, do you get a student who, again, in the same scenario, in the same environment, gets bumped just by accident, but they see it as, oh, that person did it intentionally to me. So I'm gonna push them right back and push them harder because they did that intentionally. Whereas to everyone else observing, it was like, it was a mistake. Cool down. It was not intentional. So the quality of that social emotional reciprocity can be very different, even though it's the same environment. Does that make sense, Dave?
Yeah, and you know what? I want to even take it back further, like babies, right? When
Sure.
you're interacting with a baby and you're like, ooh, and then the baby's, ooh, there's this, I forget who talks about it like this, but it's like playing tennis and you're like serving and then they receive and they hit the ball back and you're doing
Yep.
this dance of like
Sure.
interaction. Yeah. And your example is like a little bit further along where
Yep.
we have more sophisticated kind of interpretations. We do this eye contact, we do a
Yes.
smile. And so there's this social communication thing that some people can just learn by experiencing it. And really young kids on the spectrum, they might seem like cold or seem disengaged
Yes.
or and I've seen this from parents where they're just like desperately really wanting to give their child maybe what they didn't receive, right? And so
Yeah,
they're going above and beyond trying to love and connect with their child. But unfortunately, because their child is on the spectrum, they
yeah,
don't ever get that kind of back and forth, and they don't feel that their efforts are like, oh, I just loved you so much and then I get the love come back to me. That might
yeah,
not happen, right?
yeah. So even this idea of chit-chatting, right? So we were focusing on kids, but also for adults. Can you do the water cooler talk? Right? This is sometimes where I get some adults who come for an assessment and they'll be like, I don't get it. I don't understand why we're doing this water cooler talk. What's the point? And then you also get the child who you're desperately trying to have a conversation with, and they don't look at you. They think that sometimes I get this response that this conversation is a waste of time. Like, why would I talk to my parents about this? Doesn't even concern me. But
Mm.
when you think about just typical social development, you are giving some attention to the other person, even if you're not interested in a conversation, to have that reciprocity, just to be like, oh, yeah, yeah, you're right. It's really hot today.
Mm.
Just to have a chit chat about the weather, even. That's what you're looking for in terms of that social reciprocity. Are they giving the appropriate reaction back to you?
And again, it's that like feedback loop, right? So do I
Yeah.
talk more or do I talk less? Like most people as they're growing up, they're trying to figure that out. That water cooler talk,
Yeah.
does this lead to closer relationships, better relationships? So sometimes people on the spectrum, they'll individuals on the spectrum will be seen more as like having one-sided conversations where they can talk about a specific topic in depth for a long time without noticing that the other person is tuned out or not
Yeah.
interested.
Yeah.
And that kind of like being able to gauge how the other person is doing while you're also interacting with them, that's a really complex thing to do that a lot of us
Very
do
different.
naturally, right? Like that it's, we take it for granted if we don't struggle in this area.
The second area is nonverbal communicative behaviors. So, again, in human behaviors, human social behaviors, we do a lot of nonverbals that we may not even recognize. This idea of talking with our hands, the idea of if we're upset or we're sad and we're walking down the hallway, we might slouch, or maybe our pace is quite slow, we're dragging our feet. Like all of these different things that we can observe can be interpreted a certain way, whether it's emotionally, contextually. And those with ASD have a really hard time with nonverbal communication, whether it's recognizing others' behaviors or even showing nonverbal communication. So when we think of facial expressions, for example, as Dave and I are talking right now, we're smiling. Maybe sometimes we're having an inquisitive look on our faces, or sort of like, oh man, like, why did I say that? That kind of look. For those who are on the spectrum, you may see a more limited range of facial expressions. You'll usually get the typical ones where it's if you're really excited or angry or sad. But then don't forget, we have an array of other emotions: embarrassed, guilt, shocked, right? Surprised. And all these can be communicated through nonverbal expressive skills.
Yeah. And I think, as we're walking through these, we're cautious around like the stereotypical, right? This
Yes.
is again on a spectrum. So you're going to see variations in this. But one of the stereotypical aspects of like abnormal eye contact, right? And I've seen this in my office, right? And sometimes I'll say, do you mind like peeking over at your partner and checking to see what you're picking up? Like what do you think his or her or their body language is saying right now? And I'm observing both of them. And then sometimes I'll get the statement like, I don't need to look at them because they're perceiving them in a certain way using like other senses maybe. And so
Yeah.
it's complicated because, from my perspective, I'm like, I need to look at someone to be able to gauge how they're doing. And that might not be how that other person's brain works. And so there isn't that eye contact. But then again, that's just like one stereotypical aspect of it.
And this is where you have to get a really well-trained clinician to accurately and effectively complete these assessments. Because what you just said there, Dave, like I can ask the question to a parent and I can ask, does your child look at you when they talk? Oh, yes, 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 they do. To the naked eye, no pun intended, they may think, okay, yeah, the clinician may think, okay, they make eye contact. Okay, great. But you can also ask the further question, did it take a lot of effort for them to make eye contact with you? Or did you have to teach them to make eye contact with you? Very different conclusions there. Sure, they may make eye contact with you, but if you as a parent had to make a lot of effort to teach them and it didn't come naturally,
Mhm.
that's a red flag.
Well, and yeah, we're probably not going to get into this, but as adults that have survived in the world, they could have taught themselves too. I need to look at people in the
Yes.
eyes when they are speaking. And this is a rule that they learn in terms of like, this is how I can make more friends or be a better coworker at work. And so they will teach themselves to do the thing. And it might, like you said, from the observer, look like they're doing the thing, but it is not the same as this kind of, it has been a learned task almost like learning
Yes.
social skills
And
versus, yeah.
and an effortful task at that, right? I've worked with adults where they tell me I would stand in front of a mirror for hours
Mm-hmm.
practicing a greeting.
Yeah.
Whereas I can safely say for you and I, we wouldn't have to do that. We can go out into a meeting, I would say pretty confidently. And if the culture states that we shake hands with people, we shake hands with people, we can make small talk. But for those who are on the spectrum, it takes a lot of effort and it's really draining. It's exhausting.
Which kind of feeds into the third one, developing, maintaining, understanding relationships. And so it's the difficulty that of that, right? And so again, like you said, there's it's not it's the quality of it, and there's a lot of reasons why people might struggle with relationships. But for this diagnosis, this is a common kind of challenge, is this like social rules. Like if
Yes.
it's yeah, again, if it's okay here, why is it not okay there? And if it's again, they're learning rules and applying those rules in a way that might be, like you said, really effortful versus
Yeah.
someone else who just walks into a room and goes, oh, this is the vibe in this room. We're
Yeah.
allowed to interrupt each other. We're allowed to be loud and boisterous in this room. And then I can go to the next room and go, oh no, I better be prim and proper and know my manners and wait until I'm spoken to respond.
And this is again very nuanced in terms of some of the things that we'll see. It's not so much that they don't have friends, and it's not black and white like that. So as we're talking about this, I don't want people to think, oh yeah, well, kids on the spectrum, they don't have friends. In fact, they can have friends. They might not be the most extroverted kids or adults. They might have a very, very tight-knit group of friends, maybe just a couple of them, but they are the most comfortable around those individuals. Now, you throw them into a new social environment, and this is where sometimes you will see that maybe that awkwardness, that very uncomfortable kind of social communication come out where they don't know how to start a conversation. And even if they do, I hear this a lot, they have trouble maintaining a conversation. And this is where sometimes when I teach social skills, it's be interested in the other person. But again, it doesn't come naturally to them to ask questions of the other person. They just think, I just keep talking about myself. And even when they do make friendships sometimes, because part of it is like, well, I want friends, I want friends. We sort of, how do we make friends? But then the maintenance of the friendship becomes really taxing. So they've made a friend, but now it's like, what can you keep doing with a friend? If you want this friendship to last, what can you do? And it's like a blank slate. It's I don't know.
And again, we're going to jump around in terms of age and developmental stage. If you see this in the childcare, like preschool kind of kids, one of the things you might look for is like the kid who's off on their own. right? And playing with some of the toys, but really doesn't engage with a lot of the other kids. And again, there could be other reasons for this, but this is like a common kind of when you ask parents, what was your child like in daycare? Oh, okay. And again, we're starting to like all of these criteria have to be met, right? It's not just one of these, and it's not just for a period of time. Oh, my kid was shy and they had a hard time connecting with the other kids, but then we moved them to a different daycare or they went to school and they didn't, that wasn't a concern anymore.
Yeah. So, like we've covered the social communication piece, the pieces in terms of what we've talked about so far. The next piece has to do more so with behaviors, right? So now we're talking more about what you observe in terms of patterns of behaviors, their interests or activities. The first piece we'll touch on is like repetitive motor movements or use of objects or speech. Now, again, some of these pieces may not exist or become very minimized as a child grows up. Part of that could be that, yes, maybe there's a little bit of maturing and growing out of it, but also because, again, those who are more aware of their environments might understand that, ooh, I better not do some of these behaviors because maybe from experience, someone's called me out on it, or I am somewhat aware of this being sort of awkward. I should try to keep this under wraps. So, for example, with the repetitive motor movements, might be like hand flapping. You might have, some intertwining of the fingers at the midline of the body. I'm showing Dave right now. I know nobody else can see it, but you get some of those behaviors, maybe some rocking while sitting down, even the use of objects, lining up objects religiously, or getting really upset. I see this a lot actually between siblings, getting really upset when someone goes into a room and touching your stuff. Even though to the rest of the family, it's like it meant nothing. It's so minor. But to that person, it's like, don't touch my stuff. I had it there for a reason, or you can't change anything about my room. Or why did you even change the dining room? I liked it the way it was. I'm going into the next part too, actually. So we'll talk about that too. And then also speech as well. So there's some idiosyncratic speech when it comes to like repetitive use of phrases or the insistence of someone else using the same words or the same phrases, sometimes making up their own words. And so it's really interesting. They're so convinced that this is how you say a word that that child will want everybody else in the environment to say the same thing. So there's that sort of repetitiveness to it.
Yeah, I think that repetitive motor, verbal, like, and if you think of hand flapping or like doing something, like for a lot of people that are not on the spectrum, that can be self-soothing, right? That kind of
Hmm.
rocking, consistent. And so I think there's an element to that where like saying the same, making the same sound over and over again, lining things up a certain way over and over again, it can create a kind of help deal with the distress or the challenges that,
Yeah.
and again, we're guessing at this, right? But
Yeah.
a lot of like actually someone on the spectrum will come into my office and rearrange the stuff on my coffee table a certain
Yes.
way, and not doing that is actually really distressing, right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
being able to allow them to rearrange things, adjust things so that then they can also attend to the conversation.
Yeah.
Whereas other people don't really care what's on my coffee table or how my cushions are arranged on my furniture. Those don't
Yeah.
really factor in. So,
And
anyways,
that
I'm
that's
kind of, maybe I'm jumping around a bit here.
no, that speaks to the insistence of sameness and inflexibility. And I touched on this a bit too, right? They don't want their environment to change. Sometimes you do get some of that hoarding behaviors. They don't want to throw anything out. They get really inflexible about changes to their schedule, to their environment. Saturday is swim day. It better be swim day, or else it's going to be chaos at home. So really distressed even with small changes in their environments and their schedules. Maybe you take a certain route to school, right? And maybe there's construction on that day or that week, and now you have to take a different route, and that can throw off somebody, right? Or they walk into the classroom and see, hey, today's Wednesday, we're supposed to start the day off with science, and the teachers had to change things up because maybe schedule mix-ups and stuff, and that can throw a student off. right? Again, when we talk about those who are on the spectrum, they really like things oftentimes to be quite rigid, same, whereas another child might be like, they can roll with the punches, so to speak, right? Oh, now it's library in the morning instead of science. Okay, I'll just go with it. And that doesn't necessarily bother them. Again, it's not so black and white. Just because your child has this or doesn't have this doesn't say that whether they are on the spectrum or not, right? This is again the quality of the person, not just one particular criteria.
For sure. And I think, yeah, everyone's going to vary in terms of how much they like change or not like change, right? But when we're looking at this in terms of this diagnosis, the rigidity part is pretty consistent and shows up in different ways, where it might even show up in a way where the person likes to wear the exact same shirt every single day, right?
Yep.
And
Yep.
have multiple versions of that same shirt.
Yeah.
And other people would be like, that's boring, or that's you, or certain ways of eating or
Yep.
habits like at the table. And you might have other
Yep.
people saying, no, they need to be more flexible. They need to learn that they can't just have it their way all the time. No, no, no.
Yep.
They actually need it their way. And it's really important to have it their way, at least with some of the things in their life. Right. And so
Exactly.
this is where we can accommodate rather than thinking that we'll just teach them to be more flexible.
Exactly. And then the next piece is highly restricted or fixated interests. And again, for this one, sometimes it gets misinterpreted like this child or this person has to just like the one thing or the one or two things like consistently. That's not the case. So, what happens sometimes with the ASD population, the kids who I work with, they get really fixated on one thing for a period of time and they want to know everything about that thing, right? It can be trains, it can be cars, it can be whatever, the world map, and they'll memorize it. They know it, everything. And then it's like a few months later, a year later, I'm on to something else now,
It's a video
right?
game.
Yeah, it's a video game. Maybe it's like statistics in football or something, and they just get really fixated on that thing now. Now,
Yeah.
some people will be fixated on the one thing for years and years and years, maybe for the rest of their lives.
Mhm.
But then you have others who just get fixated for a period of time and they know everything about, I don't know, the solar system. And it's like, okay, I've exhausted that. Next, right? So there's that fixated interest. Sometimes these interests too are quite bizarre or can be quite bizarre, like toilets, right? I've had children who are really fascinated by the toilet or the water coming out of the hose, right? Or the way a hinge works.
And when you combine this with social reciprocity, right? So again, someone might be talking about dinosaurs or a video game, and the person they're talking to has no interest in dinosaurs or video games, but not recognizing that and continuing. And so sometimes I know, like with parents with kids on the spectrum, that the it's taxing. It's I don't care. I don't listen. I'm not interested in this, but it's really important for my child to tell me about it. And so they might be more accommodating, but the kids at school might not be, right? And it's a really hard thing to help at least young kids with.
Exactly. So the social demands when they're young are lower. And so like kids may tolerate it, but as they get older, the peers might be like, why do you keep talking about that thing? And so again, it becomes effortful to say, okay, I'm not going to talk about this. I'm not going to talk about this. But it takes effort. Whereas again, for some other kids, it's like, okay, yeah, I won't talk about it. I'm not like I can switch it up, sure.
Yeah.
The next piece is sensory hyper or hypo reactivity. So when we talk about sensory, it's those five senses. I have some kids who really don't like certain textures of food, or sometimes they'll this one's pretty cute actually. When they're lining up, especially younger kids, they start feeling the kid's hair in front of them.
Hmm. Yeah.
And then you get the person in front like turning around like, what are you doing? Like stop brushing my hair with your fingers. Or sometimes I get parents telling me like their child will just go up to their skin, like their arm and just start smelling it. Right. So there's like this hyper sensitivity to it. Some might be really sensitive to noises, certain noises, sirens, babies crying, things like that. Others have a really high tolerance with pain. So that hypo-reactivity, sometimes I get teachers and parents who are like, that would have hurt a child and like they would have been screaming in pain. But my child did not react to that.
Yeah, you can be really sensitive, really bothered by something, or the opposite, not sensitive to it. And yeah, lights, sounds, textures, the way clothing feels. And again, a lot of these environmental things that most or a lot of people will not even notice. Like they can go through their world without noticing the temperature of the room or the smell of the room or and really creating a map. And this is where OTs come in a lot, at least in my experiences, creating a sensory like understanding for the specific child, an individualized kind of understanding of whether they're sensory seeking or sensory avoiding in different areas, and
Yep.
which environments are going to be harder or easier for this child.
We just took quite a bit of time to go through this whole thing, right? Like I'm just looking at the clock. It's like there's a lot that goes into the assessment. And again, it's not so much that every single criteria has to be met. It's the quality of how it impacts one's life too. If it's really getting in the function in the way of functioning at home or at school or at work, then we're talking about the person probably is really struggling with some of these symptoms and characteristics. And we've already beat this with a hammer over the head over and over again. It's got to be early developmental onset, right? So, meaning that it's got to come from childhood. So, even when I do an assessment and an adult comes along and says, "Hey, I want to do an ASD assessment," the first question we always ask for an adult is, do you have somebody who knew you as a child really well? And we're often asking for a parent, even if they're a little bit older, to give us some highlights as to what they were like as a child.
Yeah, and I think so. Those are most of the criteria. And then looking at whether there might be other reasons for the challenges that someone is having, or the symptoms, or the presentation that we're
Yep.
seeing, right? And so
Yep.
we're looking at whether there's yeah, more or better reasons to explain someone's presentation. And so
Yep.
that's where a lot of psychologists and those that do assessment, the differential diagnosis and the overlap between different diagnoses, and finding the diagnosis that best reflects the individual's strengths and
Yep.
weaknesses. But I think important with this one, and we highlighted this in the last episode, it can be with or without intellectual impairment. So IQ has no connection, someone's intelligence has no connection to whether they meet the criteria for being on the spectrum or not. So they can be super bright or not so bright. And they
Yep.
can, and we talked about like high functioning, low functioning, right? So those that are super bright might be able to function better in the world, right? They might be able to find ways to be successful even if they have some of these social challenges or these kind of
Yep.
rigidity in terms of their preferences.
Yep.
And
Yep.
then with or without language impairment,
Yep.
right? So they can be verbal or nonverbal.
That's right. That's right. Many kids who may be on the spectrum, I'm not saying every child, but those who I've come across at the clinic and even when it comes to the question, the line of questioning that we'll ask parents is about language, right? Because social communication, so much of it has to do with language. And I would say that there's quite a few who have some sort of speech delay. Not to say that they can't speak now, but perhaps the onset of speech was a little bit later. But then I'll get parents who say, but once they started talking, they wouldn't shut up.
Yeah. Yeah. And I hope that like people are listening to this. Also, if there are parents out there that are kind of like, oh, my child checks off a couple of these boxes, perhaps an assessment earlier rather than waiting until the child is really struggling. And this is what we see sometimes in school, is that there were these indications, but there wasn't the diagnosis. And unfortunately, in the world that we live in, at least in Canada, in my province, like having a diagnosis allows for a lot more support and a lot more accommodations.
No, it's true. And again, we get referrals sometimes again, and I'll differentiate between adults and children of how we go about it at our clinic anyway. You know, if a adult comes along and they want an ASD assessment, we'll ask them, is it for any particular purpose? Because for an adult to call us there and do this independently, they're probably pretty high functioning as it is. And we'll be like, is there a purpose to this? Because otherwise, you can use your financial resources and energy into working on social skills. Find somebody who can work with you to better those social skills or emotion regulation skills rather than just getting a label or a diagnosis. Probably more helpful to work on those characteristics and symptoms than to get the diagnosis because there won't be that many supports for a high functioning adult unless your workplace provides you with it. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't.
And there's downsides to diagnosis, right? There's the possibly being labeled a certain way or seen a certain way, or other
Sure.
people are just gonna see me as autistic and not
Right.
really. So it's a a careful consideration. But in terms of getting supports at school or at work,
Yep.
like there's policies and there's laws that employers need to follow, and sometimes the challenges that are not being accommodated, we have to work in teams on this project, and it has to be 5 people in this team, whereas
Yep.
someone actually works a lot better on their own and can
Yep.
contribute in great ways on their own. But because of the culture of the workplace, that's not even a consideration. And
Yep.
sometimes with a diagnosis, then people can advocate for themselves, or they might even have a disability advocate show up with them,
Mm-hmm.
or have their
Mm-hmm.
psychologist or their mental health person write a letter to their employer that holds
Yeah.
a little more weight than them saying, like, I don't like doing these.
Yep.
I would prefer to miss this team building event. And
Yep.
it's not a prefer to miss it. It's like there's real reasons why this is a super challenging part of their work.
Interestingly, though, at the same time, we do get adults who will say, even though we give this spiel to them, they will say, I just need to know. And by knowing, and let's say they do get the diagnosis, it does bring a lot of comfort. There's an there's a question that's been answered that's probably been lingering for a long time. And to that question itself, it's probably been quite uncomfortable, like not knowing, right? So
Hmm.
there is value in knowing as an adult. You don't have to share this information or this diagnosis with anyone if you don't want to, right? It's personal healthcare information. But to them, there's value in knowing just to know now I understand why I am the way I am.
In my experience, the ASD, at least adult population, will have a will have the opposite, and they'll say like, okay, I don't care. This doesn't change anything. I don't know why this is important. I did all of these testing. And so now I have a label and it doesn't really change my life. And I'm like, I get that. But when you were talking, a lot of like my clients with ADHD that got diagnosed as an adult, that's where I saw a lot of the like, wow, this really helps me understand myself, helps me understand the struggles I had as a child. And there's a lot of like comfort or like benefit with the
Yeah.
formal diagnosis of something that didn't really have a name before. So
Yeah.
I don't know what it's like for you in terms of the ASD population and having that diagnosis. And yeah.
Yeah, there's a comfort in knowing, and sometimes I'll get some adults who will come back and say, now I can tell my family. They've been giving me such a hard time all these years, and now there's a reason for it. And I think that's self-advocacy in a way, right? And if they're open to letting family know, maybe there's an educational piece there too. What I did want to circle back to though was your point about kids. And there are a lot of services for children who do have the diagnosis. So when parents do come to us about an assessment, again, we do tell them that if there is a diagnosis, there can be services for your child and funding and all of those things that can help them navigate their world and even help the parents navigate their child's world, which I think is extremely valuable because even when we work with parents who have no idea about ASD or very little idea of ASD, they find it very, very valuable to go to workshops or to come back to us for more information and to learn how to interact with their child in a more effective way.
Yeah. And I really like, and I think we've highlighted this in different ways, but having that community. And even if, say, the rest of your family or your extended family doesn't really understand, but having other parents that are understanding and even having like parent support groups, right? It's so important to have that support. And from a clinician's perspective, when someone has the diagnosis, it
Yep.
tells me that some of these things that are challenges are not necessarily going to change. So if I'm working with a couple, like that cognitive flexibility or that kind of whereas other people will be like, okay, I'm going to work on this, I'm going to work on my empathy, right?
Yep.
It's someone on the spectrum, it's no, we're going to talk about what are the things you can observe or pick up in your partner that will tell you that they are having a bad day or that they
Yep.
are tired or that they're enjoying the conversation. And
Hmm.
yeah, again, it changes our approach for how to help someone. And I think it also changes the approach for parents and teachers and other people that are really wanting to support the neurodiversity that is going to change a little bit, but some of these things are not going to change a whole lot.
Yeah. I think there's so much conversation to be had about both the children population and the adult population when it comes to the spectrum. To your point, I see so many even parents. I know I don't do couples counseling, but look, I work with parents and some of them in terms of their dynamic is sometimes it's like one person really has a hard time reading what their partner is thinking, reading what their children are thinking and really helping them explicitly state what is it that your partner needs to support the kids, right? Like it doesn't come naturally to them.
No, and I actually this isn't part of the crate, maybe not directly part. This what happens when someone is upset or can't do these things that other people are expecting them to.
Mm.
That kind of like even for young kids that when they're hitting themselves or hitting others or biting themselves or biting others, that can be really distressing for the people around them. But
Yep,
it is actually a common
exactly.
feature for this population. And even as adults, there can be some really like self-harming behaviors
Yep.
and things that are difficult for other people to be around or to support someone with. So I think that adds an extra element that is complex about this condition.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. It can become so distressing sometimes for individuals who are on the spectrum, not understanding their environment and becoming so dysregulated, feeling so out of this world. I this reminds me, like on a couple of occasions, I have had teenagers tell me like they don't feel like they belong on this world. It's like they're
Yeah.
aliens living amongst the human race.
Yes. And
That's
that
how it's
is
been described to me. Yeah.
absolutely, that is like one of the things that as adults that are on the spectrum, they will often report a lifetime of like feeling different or feeling like they didn't fit in. That really for different people, but they're like that's going to add a different level of distress or stress that's felt like in the body. If you can just imagine yourself going into all of these different social settings and feeling like you don't belong or fit in, it's hard.
Yeah. Very, very hard. The diversity, even within the ASD population, even as we're talking about it right now, those who get extremely, extremely distressed, and then those who they may know they're on the spectrum and they just go around their merry way too, right? Like this is the diversity of our population and working with the ASD population. And I think this is why too, I know this is maybe a little bit off topic, but when the criteria for Asperger's disorder in the previous diagnostic manual was taken away, there was an uproar from the Asperger's community because they see it as a very different disorder. And so to clump it all together, like even as we're talking about it right now, and it's going through my head, and I'm doing this for so many years, it's like there's this gigantic umbrella. It's not just a big umbrella, it's a gigantic umbrella trying to fit everybody under this umbrella. But even the people underneath the umbrella are so different.
Yeah, I'm gonna this may be controversial, but I do think like IQ or intelligence, the like the the ability for someone with a higher IQ as like a protective factor in terms of functioning in the world because they have the ability to learn more rules or understand more complexities can sometimes, and I think maybe that is the Asperger's kind of population that is no, we're different, right? We're not under that umbrella.
Mhm.
But in if we're just looking at like the intuitive understanding of social rules, right? How someone can intuit those kind of reciprocity in terms of chit chat or,
Mhm.
getting along with others, that umbrella in terms of, I think, is pretty consistent. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, I don't know.
And
Tell me if I'm wrong.
you're not wrong. I think one other consideration that's really important too, from what I've seen in my clinical work, sometimes, unfortunately, the the more intelligent we are, sometimes the more aware that we are too
Oh
of
yeah.
how we situate ourselves in this world. And many people think that's great, isn't it? You're able to be more aware. But with more awareness, you're also more aware of your deficits and your weaknesses. And that is what becomes very distressing, right? So this
Hmm.
is where people become so distressed that sometimes they go into the self-harm mode, right? Because they just know they are so different. And it's very, even as we talk about it right now, it's for me to reflect on that and all the clients who I've seen and all my years of practicing, like it's sad.
Hmm.
It's sad. And we try to help them as best we can to mitigate some of that awareness, to be honest, and try to change a bit of the way they think about how aware they are of the world.
Yeah, and finding a place in this world, right? If you are aware that this is really hard, and if you get to a place where you're like, I won't ever get married, I won't ever be in a relationship, or I won't ever have kids, or that kind of not only just awareness of what's happening right now, but what your future might look like,
Yep.
and to help
Yep.
individuals find like a place where they do feel good about or do feel included or do feel like yeah, that life is worth living, like that there is that they can contribute and they can benefit and they can have part of what they're looking for. Like, and we help people with this in many different ways, right?
Yep.
Accepting who they are and accepting the things that are going on in their life and still finding meaning and purpose.
Hmm.
That's pretty common across many different challenges, but
Yep.
oh man, yeah, my
Yep.
heart does break for this population sometimes when you can see the pain and you can see that some of the things that are causing the pain might not change.
Or it's very, very, very difficult to change. And we haven't even touched on how the social environment can be helpful or unhelpful,
Mhm.
right? The family life, friendships or no friendships, school life. Like we haven't even touched on that. So we've today we've primarily talked about the diagnostic criteria, which may be more biological, the characteristics of that, and then we went off a little bit on a tangent about the distressing behaviors and thoughts and emotions. But we haven't even talked about other things that can bring that distress, which is the environment. Right. So when we talk about, or when I work with a family, a lot of the time, we'll talk about how can we change things in the environment. It's not just about the person, it's the environment as well. So maybe we can leave that for another episode because I can go on and on about this. It's a fascinating area of psychology.
Yes, yes, let's do that. Let's talk more about the accommodation or supporting people with changes in the environment. And I'll just make one little note about I know we talked about this off air, but in terms of measures or
Mm,
questionnaires that are used in part of this diagnosis, it's going to cover the areas that we talked about, but
yes.
it'll be rated by, say, teachers or parents or individuals themselves, and it can provide you with a score at the end of it that says, yes, you likely fit this diagnosis. So there are what some people would consider more objective measures, right?
Yep.
And then we're also looking at interviews, and we're looking at observations and multiple
Yes.
sources of information to come up with hopefully a diagnosis that really reflects the individual, at least in
Yeah.
this area.
It really annoys me, Dave, when I see an assessment and they just use one tool. I don't even remember if we talked about this in the last episode, but if you're looking for an assessment, I really hope that you do an interview with the clinic, with the clinician about what they do, not even necessarily about the tools that they use. Because, look, I know some old school psychologists that can do an amazing assessment without the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule, second edition, the ADOS-2, right? I'm going to label it because last time I know I said it, but I didn't say what it was. But they can still do an amazing assessment without that particular tool. Look, it's got to be multifaceted. It can't just be based on one tool, right? So if someone says, "Oh, we just do the ADOS-2 and we'll let you know if there's a diagnosis." I would run away from that clinic as fast as you can because there has to be parent interviews, there has to be a teacher interview, observation of the student. And look, if it's a case where it's a bit of a toss up, I would hope that that clinician says, "Hey, can I get permission to go observe your child at the school?" Because that
Mhm.
is the most social environment that that clinician is going to get to see that child, right? I'm not saying that it has to be done. Look, there's just some clear-cut cases.
Yeah.
But if a clinician says, I was really on the fence about this, did you go do a school observation? And there may be some clinicians listening going, Andrew, what the heck, man? You're making us do more work. I just want the families who we work with to get a good and solid assessment.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, we are pulling back the curtain a little bit and letting the public know about some of these things. And I'm going to go on this ledge a little bit, not so much for ASD, but ADHD. I'll have people like approach me or contact me and say, what's the cheapest way I can get this done? And I'm like, the cheapest way is probably through the public healthcare system, probably through your family doctor. And the easiest way and the cheapest way could be like filling out a questionnaire, having a 5 minute conversation, and then getting a diagnosis, right? The risk with that, like you're saying, is someone doesn't really know, like they know that you meet those criteria, but like when we're looking at ASD, we're looking at ADHD, we're looking at social anxiety, we're looking at OCD, we're looking at trauma related presentations or other kind of reasons why someone might have certain things that they would check off on a checklist, right? So it is more
Exactly.
expensive because our public health care system does not cover these assessments, or there's long wait lists. I've heard of people being
Yep.
on a wait list for 3 or 4 years for an autism like
Yep.
assessment.
Yep.
And that kid or that adult is in the world for 3 or 4 years, potentially without the supports they need. So we are operating within the confines or the limits of also like the public healthcare and the healthcare systems that we have. So those with money could speed up the process and get probably a more thorough assessment, and those without can wait a long time or not get a proper assessment. And that is just
Exactly.
the reality. I'm sorry. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I think that's our sort of PSA today,
Yeah.
public service announcement to really do your research if you're interested in having an assessment, whether it's for yourself or your child, and hopefully it's a proper one and with a clinician you're comfortable with, right? Because they need to sort of see you for who you are, right? If you're masking, and we can talk about masking next time too. But if you don't feel comfortable and you feel like you have to be somebody else in front of that person, you're not going to get a proper assessment.
All right. So hopefully today, those that were listening all the way to the end, and we're hoping that you took away something about in terms of what ASD can possibly look like and what are the key features that need to be there to get, a formal diagnosis. And we are going to talk more about what do you do with that? Like what do we do with this information in the real world after to help people, to support people, And again, this is our mission for this podcast, is that people take better care of themselves and take better care of the people around them. So we're going to
Absolutely.
stay true to that, even with the changes that are coming for the season 2.
And that's why I think we stay true to the title of our podcast too, right? It really is taking good care around the people, around you, yourself, our mental health, our health in general. So with that being said, take what you will from this podcast today. It was a deep dive into the characteristics of ASD. And I don't think we can get away from knowing people. Even if they're not formally diagnosed, you're going to run into people who you're like, that individual was different. Right? So if this gives you a little bit more insight, a little bit more education, I think Dave and I have done our jobs for today.
Yeah, a little more compassion, a little more understanding, I think goes a long way. So
Exactly. If you've enjoyed this podcast today, this episode, follow us, send us questions, comments. And again, we look forward to showing you some of the changes that hopefully will be coming within the next month or so. And in the meantime, take good care.
take care, everyone.